They waited until Christmas night, not because they were merciful, because they knew no one would hear her scream. It was December 25th, 1852, and the plantation bells had rung their hollow cheer hours before. Inside the big house, candles flickered against frosted windows, casting dancing shadows across silk curtains and polished mahogany. Outside, in the frozen dirt behind the tobacco barn, where the wind cut like broken glass, Clara knelt with her wrists bound behind her back, watching the overseer sharpen a leather strap against his boot. The sound was rhythmic, deliberate, a promise. She had committed no crime. She had stolen nothing. She had harmed no one. She had only refused to smile. The masters called it insolence. She called it the last thread of her soul, the final piece of herself they had not yet managed to steal. What happened that night in the Virginia cold, when the temperature plunged below freezing, and the stars hung like shards of ice in a black sky, would travel in whispers through 3 states, not because of what they did to her, but because of what they could not break. This is the story they buried in unmarked graves and unwritten pages. The survival that shook 1852, the woman who made her masters afraid, and the silence that became louder than any scream. Her name was Clara, and this is how she refused to die. Whitmore Plantation sat on 417 acres of tobacco and cornfields, 17 miles south of Richmond, Virginia, where the James River curved like a scar through the landscape. Winter came hard in 1852. The Little Ice Age was still gripping North America, bringing temperatures that froze rivers solid and turned breath into clouds of white vapor that hung in the air like ghosts. Ice locked the James River for weeks at a time. Snow fell in November and did not fully melt until March. Smoke rose from slave cabins in thin gray threads, barely enough to keep the cold from killing children in their sleep. The cabins themselves were crude wooden structures, 14 feet square, with dirt floors and gaps between the wallboards wide enough to slide a hand through. Each cabin housed 8 to 12 people, families if they were fortunate enough not to have been separated by sale. The chimneys were made of mud and sticks, always crumbling, always smoking more than heating, filling lungs with ash while bodies shivered under threadbare blankets. The masters lived in warmth, feather beds imported from England, fireplaces that roared with oak logs, wool carpets, hot meals served on porcelain. The enslaved lived in survival, huddled together for body heat, waking with frost on their hair and blankets, eating cornmeal mush and salt pork once a day, working from dawn until dark, 6 days a week, with hands so cold they could barely feel the tobacco leaves they stripped from stalks. Christmas on the plantation was not joy. It was theater, a performance where the enslaved were forced to play grateful for scraps while the masters watched from porches and windows, measuring every face for signs of discontent. Master Whitmore was 52 years old, the 3rd generation of his family to own this land and the people who worked it. He had inherited 143 enslaved people from his father. He had purchased 27 more. He had sold 18. He kept ledgers. He knew every name, every age, every skill, every price. He saw them as livestock. Valuable livestock, yes, but livestock nonetheless. And Clara had stopped pretending otherwise. That was her crime. That was why, on Christmas Eve of 1852, he told Overseer Garrett to wait until the next night, after the prayers, after the 4 songs, when the cold was deepest and the darkness most complete. They would make an example that would last. Clara had been born on Whitmore Plantation 28 years before, in the winter of 1824, in a cabin with no floor and a roof that leaked rain through the gaps in the wood. Her mother died 3 days after childbirth, bleeding out while the midwife whispered prayers and pressed cloth between her legs. Her father was sold south to a cotton plantation in Alabama when Clara was 5 years old. She remembered him only as a tall shadow who sang songs in a language she did not understand. words his grandfather had carried across the ocean from a place no one would ever name. Clara learned early that hope was dangerous. That love was a weapon the masters used against you. That attachment meant pain because anything you loved could be taken, sold, destroyed without warning or mercy. She grew up silent, watchful. She learned to read faces, to sense danger before it arrived, to make herself small and invisible when the masters walked through the quarters. She worked in the fields until she was 14, then in the big house as a housemaid, scrubbing floors, and washing laundry and serving meals to people who never looked at her face. And then, in the winter of 1843, when she was 19 years old, something changed. She gave birth to a daughter. The father was another enslaved man named Jacob, who had been sold away 2 months before Clara realized she was pregnant. She named the baby Rose, after the only beautiful thing she had ever been allowed to touch, a rosebush that grew outside the kitchen window of the big house. For 3 years, Clara held that child every night. She sang songs her own mother never got to sing to her. She memorized the shape of Rose's fingers, small and perfect. The way she laughed when rain drummed the cabin roof. The way she smelled like wood smoke and milk and sweetness. The way her eyes caught light like amber when the morning sun came through the gaps in the walls. Clara loved her daughter with a ferocity that terrified her, because she knew what love meant in this place. It meant vulnerability. It meant a wound that could never heal. And one morning in March of 1846, her worst fear became real. Master Whitmore walked into her cabin with a ledger book and a man in a black coat and a flat-brimmed hat. The man was a slave trader from Georgia. He was buying children for a cotton plantation near Savannah. Rose was 3 years old, the perfect age for training. Clara screamed until her voice shattered. She clawed at the dirt until her nails broke and bled. She tried to run after the wagon, and Garrett struck her unconscious with the butt of his rifle. When she woke hours later, face swollen and covered in mud, Rose was gone. She would never see her daughter again. She would never know if Rose remembered her, if she grew up, if she survived. And something inside Clara died that day. The part that hoped. The part that smiled. The part that pretended this life was bearable. From that moment forward, her face became stone. And that stone would become more dangerous than any rebellion. The years after Rose's sale passed like a slow drowning. Clara worked. She obeyed. But her silence became a presence that filled rooms and made people uncomfortable. She no longer sang the songs the masters demanded during harvest. She no longer bowed her head when Mistress Whitmore gave orders. She simply stared, blank-faced, and did what was required with mechanical precision. No more, no less. The other enslaved people understood. Some pitied her. Some feared her, but all of them recognized what she was doing. She was withdrawing her humanity from their reach, refusing to perform the role of the grateful, content slave that made the masters feel justified in their cruelty. And that refusal enraged them more than any act of physical rebellion ever could, because it reminded them every day that they could own bodies but not souls, that they could force labor but not love, that beneath all their laws and ledgers and weapons, their power rested on a lie. By Christmas of 1852, Master Whitmore had decided Clara was not just disobedient. She was contagious. Other enslaved people had begun to watch her, to imitate her silence, to withhold their smiles. During the Christmas season, when enslaved people were traditionally given a few days of rest and small gifts of food or cloth, the masters expected gratitude. They expected singing and dancing and visible joy, proof that slavery was not so terrible after all, that the enslaved were happy with their lot. It was political. It was propaganda. And Clara refused to participate. On Christmas Eve, Master Whitmore distributed the yearly gifts: a pound of cornmeal per family, a strip of salt pork, a tin cup of molasses. He walked through the quarters with Mistress Whitmore beside him, both dressed in their finest clothes, watching faces carefully, cataloging every expression. Most of the enslaved people smiled and nodded and said thank you in voices that trembled with fear disguised as gratitude. But when Whitmore reached Clara's cabin and handed her the small bundle of cornmeal, she took it without a word. No smile. No thank you. Just empty eyes that looked through him like he was smoke. He felt it like a physical blow, a rejection of his authority, his benevolence, his very existence. And in that moment, staring into Clara's blank face, he made his decision. She would be broken, publicly, brutally, unforgettably, on Christmas night, when the cold was deepest and everyone was alone with their fear. He would show them all what happened to those who forgot their place. He told Garrett to prepare, after dark, behind the tobacco barn, and to make sure it lasted. Christmas Day passed in tense, hollow silence. The enslaved community knew something was coming. They always knew. Fear had a smell, a texture, a weight that pressed down on the quarters like fog. Children were kept inside. Voices were hushed. People moved carefully, avoiding eye contact, trying not to draw attention. Clara spent the day in her cabin, sitting on the wooden plank that served as her bed, staring at the wall where a single nail held a scrap of cloth she had torn from Rose's baby dress years before. She did not eat. She did not speak. She simply waited. As the sun set and darkness swallowed the plantation, the temperature plummeted. By 8 o'clock, it was below freezing. By 9, the ground was hard as iron. At 10 o'clock, there was a knock on Clara's door. It was not a request. Garrett stood outside with 2 other white men, overseers from neighboring plantations, men whose faces Clara did not recognize, but whose eyes she knew well. The eyes of men who enjoyed cruelty. "Master wants to see you," Garrett said, though they both knew it was not a conversation. Clara stood slowly. She did not ask why. She did not beg. She wrapped a thin shawl around her shoulders and stepped into the night. The cold hit her like a fist. Her breath came out in white clouds. Her bare feet, wrapped in strips of cloth because she owned no shoes, crunched against frozen mud. They walked her to the tobacco barn, a large wooden structure that smelled of dried leaves and rats and mildew. Behind it, in a clearing lit by 2 lanterns hanging from posts, Master Whitmore waited. He wore a heavy wool coat, leather gloves, a hat with a wide brim. He looked warm, comfortable, untouchable. Beside him stood more white men, 6 in total, all holding tools, rope, shackles, buckets. Clara's heart began to pound, but she forced her face to remain blank. She would not give them fear, not yet. Garrett grabbed her arms and forced her to her knees. The frozen ground cut through her dress like knives. He tied her wrists behind her back with rough hemp rope that bit into her skin. Then he tied the rope to a wooden post driven into the ground, pulling it tight so she could not move, could not stand, could not escape. Master Whitmore stepped forward, his breath fogging in the lantern light. He did not raise his voice. He simply said, in a tone as cold as the air, "You have forgotten your place. You have forgotten gratitude. You have forgotten that everything yours belongs to me. Tonight you will remember." Clara looked up at him, and for one brief moment, her eyes burned brighter than the lantern flames. She opened her mouth and spoke 6 words that would echo through that plantation for months. 6 words that would haunt Whitmore's sleep and spread like fire through the slave quarters and beyond. "You will never make me smile." Garrett struck her across the face with the back of his hand. Her head snapped to the side. Blood filled her mouth, and the punishment began. They did not use the whip. Whip scars were visible, permanent, and visible scars raised uncomfortable questions when abolitionists or traveling ministers came through. Virginia asking about conditions on plantations. Scars were evidence. Testimony written in flesh. So the men who brutalized enslaved people had learned subtler methods. Methods that left fewer marks. Methods that destroyed the body from the inside. They used cold. It was December 25th, past midnight now, the temperature hovering near 20 degrees Fahrenheit. Garrett and the other overseers stripped Clara of her shawl, leaving her in only the thin gray dress that offered no protection against the night. Then they removed her shoes, unwrapping the cloth strips from her feet and exposing bare skin to frozen mud. Clara's body began to shake immediately, violent shivers that rattled her bones. But she did not speak, did not beg. Garrett brought forward a wooden bucket filled with water from the well. He lifted it above Clara's head and poured. The water was ice cold, just above freezing, and it soaked her hair, her dress, her skin, running down her back and chest and arms in streams that turned her clothing into a second layer of ice. Within minutes, her dress began to freeze. Patches of fabric stiffened. Ice crystals formed on her shoulders, her sleeves, her hair. The pain was unlike anything she had ever known. It was not sharp. It was slow. A burning cold that crawled into her bones, her joints, her chest. Her lungs ached with every breath. Her fingers and toes went numb first, then her hands and feet, then her arms and legs. Her body shook so violently the ropes cut deeper into her wrists, drawing blood that froze against her skin in dark red lines. The white men stood in a circle, watching, drinking whiskey from flasks to stay warm, laughing about something unrelated, a horse race, a card game. To them, this was routine. To Clara, this was death arriving slowly. They poured more water, and more. Every 15 minutes, another bucket. Her dress became a shell of ice. Her hair became rigid. Her lips turned blue, then purple. Her eyelids grew heavy. Hypothermia was setting in, shutting down her body piece by piece, pulling her toward unconsciousness and then toward the final sleep. But somewhere deep in the cold, in the place beyond pain where the mind retreats to survive, Clara made a choice. She would not break. She would not scream. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her destroyed. She fixed her eyes on the stars above, on the infinite cold light that had been there long before this plantation existed, and would be there long after it turned to dust. She thought of Rose. She thought of her mother. She thought of every enslaved person who had died without their story being told, without their names being remembered. And she disappeared inside herself, into a space they could never reach, a place where her soul remained her own. Hours passed. The lantern flames flickered. The white men grew bored and cold. Near 3 a.m, Master Whitmore finally gave the order. Leave her. Let the night finish it. They walked away, back to warm houses. Warm beds, warm food. They left Clara tied to the post, unconscious now, her body blue and stiff, her breath shallow and barely visible. They expected her to be dead by dawn. They were wrong. Notice protagonist of blow. It was Thomas who saved her life. 45 years old, enslaved since birth, he had watched Clara grow up. He had known her mother. He had held Clara when she was an infant. He had watched her lose Rose and seen her soul turn to iron. He had not been allowed to intervene during the punishment. None of them had. To step forward would have meant their own death. So they had watched from cabin windows and door cracks, silent witnesses to atrocity, hating themselves and hating the masters and hating the world that made this possible. But near 3 a.m, when the overseers finally left Clara and returned to their warm beds, Thomas crept from his cabin. He carried a wool blanket he had hidden under his floorboards for years, stolen piece by piece from the big house laundry. He carried a small tin of animal fat used to grease wagon wheels, saved for moments of desperate need. And he carried a knife with a wooden handle, hidden for 2 years, sharp enough to cut rope. He found Clara tied to the post behind the barn, slumped forward, motionless. Her dress was frozen solid. Her hair was white with frost. Her face was blue. Her wrists were bleeding where the ropes had cut through skin. Thomas thought she was dead. He knelt beside her, tears streaming down his face, and pressed his ear to her chest. For a long moment, he heard nothing. Just wind, just his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. And then, faint and slow, he heard it. A heartbeat. Barely there, barely alive, but fighting. Thomas cut the ropes with shaking hands. Clara's body slumped into his arms, cold as stone, rigid as wood. He wrapped her in the blanket and dragged her into the tobacco barn, pulling her behind stacks of dried leaves where she would be hidden if anyone came looking. He buried her in the leaves for insulation, then began the desperate work of trying to bring her back from the edge of death. He rubbed the animal fat into her hands and feet, trying to restore circulation, trying to warm frozen flesh before frostbite turned to gangrene. He whispered prayers in Gullah, the Creole language his grandmother had taught him, words older than America, older than slavery, words that carried the voices of ancestors who had survived the Middle Passage and countless other horrors. He prayed to spirits, to gods, to the universe, to anything that might listen. And slowly, painfully, impossibly, Clara's body began to respond. Her eyelids fluttered. Her fingers twitched. Her lips moved, forming words without sound. Near dawn, as gray light began to seep through the barn slats and roosters crowed from the yards, Clara's eyes opened. They were glazed, unfocused, but conscious. She looked at Thomas, and her cracked, bleeding lips formed two words. "I didn't break." Thomas nodded, tears streaming into his gray beard. "I know, child. I know." He gave her water from a tin cup he had brought. She could barely swallow. He gave her a piece of cornbread from his own ration, saved from the day before. She chewed slowly, mechanically, her jaw barely working. They sat in silence as the plantation woke around them. Bells rang. Voices called. Orders were shouted. The machinery of slavery grinding forward as it did every day, indifferent to suffering, indifferent to death. Thomas knew he could not keep Clara hidden forever, but he could give her a few more hours, a few more moments of stillness before the world demanded she return to it. What neither of them knew was that they were being watched. Mistress Whitmore had not slept all night. She had stood at her bedroom window, staring out at the dark, imagining Clara frozen and dying behind the barn. And when she saw Thomas creep across the yard in the pre-dawn darkness, when she saw him carry something into the barn, she knew. Clara had survived. And Mistress Whitmore, for the first time in her life, felt something she had never felt toward an enslaved person before: fear. It was Thomas who saved her life. 45 years old, enslaved since birth, he had watched Clara grow up. He had known her mother. He had held Clara when she was an infant. He had watched her lose Rose and seen her soul turn to iron. He had not been allowed to intervene during the punishment. None of them had. To step forward would have meant their own death. So they had watched from cabin windows and door cracks, silent witnesses to atrocity, hating themselves and hating the masters and hating the world that made this possible. But near 3 in the morning, when the overseers finally left Clara and returned to their warm beds, Thomas crept from his cabin. He carried a wool blanket he had hidden under his floorboards for years, stolen piece by piece from the big house laundry. He carried a small tin of animal fat used to grease wagon wheels, saved for moments of desperate need. And he carried a knife with a wooden handle, hidden for 2 years, sharp enough to cut rope. He found Clara tied to the post behind the barn, slumped forward, motionless. Her dress was frozen solid. Her hair was white with frost. Her face was blue. Her wrists were bleeding where the ropes had cut through skin. Thomas thought she was dead. He knelt beside her, tears streaming down his face, and pressed his ear to her chest. For a long moment, he heard nothing. Just wind, just his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. And then, faint and slow, he heard it. A heartbeat. Barely there, barely alive, but fighting. Thomas cut the ropes with shaking hands. Clara's body slumped into his arms, cold as stone, rigid as wood. He wrapped her in the blanket and dragged her into the tobacco barn, pulling her behind stacks of dried leaves where she would be hidden if anyone came looking. He buried her in the leaves for insulation, then began the desperate work of trying to bring her back from the edge of death. He rubbed the animal fat into her hands and feet, trying to restore circulation, trying to warm frozen flesh before frostbite turned to gangrene. He whispered prayers in Gullah, the Creole language his grandmother had taught him, words older than America, older than slavery, words that carried the voices of ancestors who had survived the Middle Passage and countless other horrors. He prayed to spirits, to gods, to the universe, to anything that might listen. And slowly, painfully, impossibly, Clara's body began to respond. Her eyelids fluttered. Her fingers twitched. Her lips moved, forming words without sound. Near dawn, as gray light began to seep through the barn slats and roosters crowed from the yards, Clara's eyes opened. They were glazed, unfocused, but conscious. She looked at Thomas, and her cracked, bleeding lips formed two words. "I didn't break." Thomas nodded, tears streaming into his gray beard. "I know, child. I know." He gave her water from a tin cup he had brought. She could barely swallow. He gave her a piece of cornbread from his own ration, saved from the day before. She chewed slowly, mechanically, her jaw barely working. They sat in silence as the plantation woke around them. Bells rang, voices called, orders were shouted. The machinery of slavery grinding forward as it did every day, indifferent to suffering, indifferent to death. Thomas knew he could not keep Clara hidden forever, but he could give her a few more hours, a few more moments of stillness before the world demanded she return to it. What neither of them knew was that they were being watched. Mistress Whitmore had not slept all night. She had stood at her bedroom window, staring out at the dark, imagining Clara frozen and dying behind the barn. And when she saw Thomas creep across the yard in the pre-dawn darkness, when she saw him carry something into the barn, she knew. Clara had survived. And Mistress Whitmore, for the first time in her life, felt something she had never felt toward an enslaved person before: fear. Clara could not walk. Her feet were black with frostbite, the flesh frozen and dying, her toes swollen and split. Her hands would not close. Her fingers were rigid, the joints frozen, the skin mottled with purple and gray. Her face was pale as ash, her lips cracked and bleeding. But it was her eyes that unsettled people. They were not the eyes of a broken woman. They were not the eyes of someone defeated. They were the eyes of someone who had survived something they should not have survived. And that survival was an accusation. It said, without words, that the masters were not gods, that their power had limits, that the human spirit could endure more than they believed possible. Thomas carried Clara back to her cabin before full daylight. Mama Bess, the eldest woman in the quarters, was already there, boiling water over the small fire, preparing claws. She had known Clara would survive. She had seen too much death to mistake it for this. Clara was placed on her wooden plank bed, wrapped in every spare blanket the community could gather without raising suspicion. Mama Bess cleaned her wounds with hot water and whiskey. She wrapped her hands and feet in cloth soaked in herbs, old remedies passed down through generations, plants that grew in hidden places and were never spoken of to white people. The pain was extraordinary. As Clara's body slowly warmed, as blood returned to frozen limbs, the agony was worse than the cold itself. She bit down a strip of leather to keep from screaming. Sweat poured from her face despite the winter chill. But she did not break. On December 27th, Master Whitmore sent for Dr. Morrison, a white physician who served the plantation families and occasionally treated enslaved people when their economic value was threatened. Morrison arrived in a black carriage, carrying a leather bag filled with instruments and bottles. He examined Clara in silence. He had seen frostbite before. He had seen worse. But something about Clara disturbed him. Her eyes followed him as he worked, not pleading, not afraid, just watching, measuring, remembering. He cleaned her wounds with alcohol that burned like fire. He examined her blackened toes and fingers, pressing them gently, watching for signs of sensation. There was almost none. He told Master Whitmore, in the clinical voice of a man discussing livestock, that Clara would likely lose 2 toes and possibly 3 fingers. That infection was probable. That she might not survive the week. He prescribed willow bark tea for pain and told them to keep the wounds clean. Then he took his payment, $5 in silver coins, and left. That night, alone in his study, Dr. Morrison opened his private journal, a leather-bound book he kept locked in a drawer. He wrote one sentence: "Treated a Negro woman today for deliberate frostbite exposure. I am complicit in an atrocity. God forgive me." He would never speak of Clara again, but he would never forget her eyes. Clara arrived at the Raleigh textile mill on January 13th, 1853. The mill was a massive 3-story brick building that shook day and night with the thunder of mechanical looms, a sound that drowned out thought and conversation and prayer. Inside, the air was thick with cotton dust that coated lungs and skin, turning everyone gray. Enslaved workers, mostly women and children, labored 16 hours a day, 6 days a week, their hands moving in mechanical rhythm, feeding thread and fabric into machines that could crush fingers or tear off limbs with one moment of inattention. Many lost fingers. Many developed lung diseases that killed them before they reached 30. Clara was assigned to a loom on the 2nd floor. Her hands had not fully healed. 2 of her toes had been amputated by the mill's doctor, cut off with a saw and no anesthetic beyond whiskey. Every movement sent pain shooting through her body, but she worked. And within a week, the other enslaved workers knew her story. They called her the Christmas Ghost, the woman the cold could not kill, the woman whose soul stayed her own. In the dark hours before dawn, in the sleeping quarters where 40 women lay on wooden planks, they told her story in whispers, over and over, like a hymn, like a prayer, like a promise that survival was possible. Clara lived 25 more years. She never saw Rose again. She never learned what happened to her daughter, whether she survived, whether she remembered, whether she ever wondered about the mother who sang to her in a dark cabin long ago. Clara never married, never had other children, never spoke of Christmas night unless someone asked directly. And when they did, she would say only this, in a voice quiet as breath: "They wanted my smile. I kept it." After emancipation in 1865, when the 13th Amendment ended slavery and Clara walked out of the textile mill, a free woman for the first time in her life, she stayed in Raleigh. She worked as a seamstress, sewing clothes for wages, earning her own money, owning her own time. She saved every penny. By 1870, she had bought a small wooden house with 2 rooms and a garden. She planted roses, red ones, yellow ones, pink ones, every color she could find. She tended them with hands scarred by frostbite and millwork, hands that had forgotten how to be gentle but remembered how to survive. Every Christmas Eve for the rest of her life, Clara lit a single candle in her window. She would stand outside, barefoot on the cold ground, for 1 full minute, eyes closed, remembering the stars, remembering the choice she made to survive, remembering that her soul had always been her own, even when everything else was stolen. She died in 1878 on a warm spring morning, in her own bed, in her own house, surrounded by roses. She was 54 years old. Her story was mostly forgotten, buried under a century of silence and shame, but it lived in whispers, in songs, in the eyes of people who refuse to break. Because survival, true survival, is not just staying alive. It is keeping the part of yourself they want to steal. It is saying no when the world demands yes. It is standing in the cold and staring at the stars and choosing, against all reason, to live. Clara chose, and that choice shook 1852. If this story held your breath, Imagine the ones still buried in the dark. Subscribe, turn on notifications, and tell us which forgotten story we should uncover next.